No Straight Roads is kind of a mixed bag of a game. It's got mechanics that don't need to be there, boring levels, and a whole host of technical problems in the Switch version. Seriously, do not play the Switch version if you can help it. However, it's also got a great art style, phenomenal soundtrack, and one of the best boss lineups I've seen in a video game, even though there's only 6 of them. I definitely wish there were more, but this small number allows me to go into as much detail as I want when ranking them. The only thing I need to clarify here is that I'm not putting DK West on the list, as he's more of a series of mini-games than a boss. If you're wondering where I'd put him, it would be toward the bottom. Sure, he's a cool character, and the rap battles between him and Zook are great, but these fights are so brutal, they're borderline impossible in the Switch version. Seriously, why are there no healing items? Aside from that, there's not much to say. Let's get right into it. Despite this game having a great boss lineup, there is one that sticks out like a sore thumb. And sadly, it's also the final boss. Tatiana is the meat circus of No Straight Roads. She's not as bad as the meat circus, but I hate her for the same reason as the meat circus. At the end of a game with so many grand, epic, and creative bosses, we get one that's generic, frustrating, and above all else, underwhelming. Let's start with one of the strangest parts of the fight, the theme. The whole fight is themed around time. The battlefield is a clock face, Tatiana wields 2 clock hands as weapons, and she makes some comments about time being on her side. This is weird because Tatiana never even brings up the concept of time outside of this fight. It just comes out of left field. And that would be fine if it were just a regular boss fight, but for the main villain, that seems like something you would want to indicate beforehand. Maybe it's because Tatiana likes when things are smooth and predictable, both like the flow of time and EDM as a genre, but that seems like kind of a stretch to me. So how does the fight play? Well, Tatiana starts off by shooting at you from a platform while you have to hit this glowing yellow thing that keeps circling the clock. I was stuck on this part for a while because there's no indication you have to do that other than the fact it's literally the only thing you can hit, and there's no clear reason why you need to hit it. This might seem like a minor thing to harp away on, but you have to do this several times throughout the fight, and each time it's both frustrating and makes no sense. Things aren't much better when Tatiana joins the battlefield. She essentially has 2 attacks, slicing at you with her clock hands and shooting fireballs at you, all while teleporting around the room like a Kirby boss. You have to find openings between her attacks to go in and hit her, which will eventually form a giant key that you have to shoot at her. Why does it form a key, and why do you have to shoot it at her? I have no idea. The fight continues like this until it's over, and no meaningful changes really happen to the visuals or gameplay. The most that happens is that Tatiana gets another clock hand and the background changes a few times, which is honestly kind of pathetic given how much the other fights in this game change as they go along. Also, who's that guy on the far right stained glass window? I don't remember seeing him. Is that supposed to be DK West? Because it looks nothing like him. Everything in this fight feels generic and bog standard for a boss in a video game, which you do not want for the final boss to a game like this. It applies to the music as well, which would be fine in another game, but in a game like this that has such unique boss themes, this one kind of feels like they just searched up final boss theme in an audio library. And then there's the technical aspect. This fight is glitched to hell and back in the Switch version. I've had at least 3 separate occasions when I shot the key at Tatiana, but for some reason it didn't register as hitting her, and instead restarted that phase of the fight. I also fell off the stage at one point, which is clearly not supposed to be possible. The worst part of this is the elevator. When you first fight Tatiana, you go up in an elevator while she plays a message over the speakers. This segment lasts about 1.5 minutes. You have to go through it again every time you either die to her or restart the fight due to a glitch, and since it's not a cutscene, you can't skip it. This all really sucks because Tatiana as a character is pretty decent, but this fight is a waste of an interesting villain and a big letdown after all the amazing bosses you fought to get here. When I first fought 1010, I walked away with a pretty negative opinion on them, but I think a lot of that was because they have the worst approach segment in the game. The fight itself is pretty good, albeit not up to the same high standards as the other bosses. Let's start with the concept. 1010 is a boy band made up of robots that are mass-produced in a factory. Now, part of me's tempted to say that Gravity Falls beat them to the joke, but I think that's a bit unfair. For one thing, the manager of Several Times wasn't a drill sergeant who treated his band like a military unit. name it. That dynamic, coupled with the manager's personality and 1010's one-liners, is where a lot of the charm in this fight comes from, especially because both the setting and the music are easily the least interesting of the good boss fights. But how's the fight itself? It's good, but also pretty poorly thought out. The first phase will end pretty quickly because you just have to take out one of the 1010 members. The second phase is a little irritating just because of the way it's structured. You see, all of the 1010 members have shields that only go down after their attacks, so you have to be ready to rush over and attack the moment their guard is dropped. The train will periodically stop at a station where the boys will pose for fans, fully healing them. At this point, the boss will show up to spit out a quote of any 1010 member you killed since the last stop. He's your real target, and you need to shoot notes at him. How do you get notes? By killing 1010 members, of course. However, due to the way they move around and the shields, it's highly doubtful you'll be able to kill more than one of them in between stops. This means you only have a couple of shots to fire at the boss, making this phase of the fight feel like it goes at a snail's pace. And the thing is, 1010's attacks are fun to avoid, but having this phase of the fight revolve around waiting will make you get sick of them pretty quick. Then, once you deal enough damage, their skin comes off, and you have to go through the cycle again, which is pretty frustrating considering how many times you've gone through it already. They meet the fans who freak out, which is actually pretty funny, and then you fight the boss himself. This is easily the best part of the fight. He has a wide variety of attacks so they don't get stale, and they produce notes, so your opportunities to damage him don't feel bottlenecked. The only problem is, especially compared to the second phase, this part feels like it's over way too fast. In the end, this fight is still good. Even the second phase is kinda fun. I just feel like if they put more thought into this fight and reworked it a bit, it will be on the same level as the next 4. Okay, this is where things start getting good. Like, these 4 bosses are the reason I say this game is such a good boss lineup. So, who's the worst of the best? Arguably the most famous boss in the game, Sayu. Sayu is an interesting concept for sure. She's Vinyl City's equivalent of the creator of Minecraft and Harry Potter, Hatsune Miku. So as a result, you can't damage her directly. Instead, you go into her server and damage the links her creators have to her. I might as well say it now, the reason she's the lowest of the great bosses is the fact that this fight plays more like a level than a boss. You move around the level using the transform ability to move between islands and attack these computer window things. Now, this isn't bad, and arguably works better for this boss than a traditional fight would, but I still prefer a traditional fight over a level, and you have to split hairs somewhere. So now that that's out of the way, why do I consider Sayu a great boss? Literally everything else. For starters, the setting is cool and pretty clever, combining the undersea aesthetic to match with Sayu being a mermaid, and the inside of a computer program to match with the fact that she's just a piece of software. Also, these two motifs work together to make it look like you're fighting your way through one of those vaporwave environments, but with brighter colors, which is both beautiful and clever. The way Sayu changes throughout the fight is pretty interesting as well. In between phases, you see glimpses of her silent creators getting together to make her more and more powerful. And each time, the artist changes her design. At first, he makes her more cute, then more extravagant, and the video editor changes the lighting, which makes Sayu look both more like a deep sea creature and more like a computer glitch. Also, the glow sticks make it look like a rave, or more appropriately, like a Vocaloid concert. That's 3 clever meanings rolled into one design change. Once you've beaten this phase, you actually have to escape from Sayu and run back to the beginning of the level while dodging her attacks so the final phase can begin. This leads the artist to turn Sayu into this horrifying thing. The final phase is especially intense, as Sayu's attacks are now cranked up to 11, and instead of being able to hit the creator windows normally, you have to shoot at them, which gives you more wiggle room to dodge Sayu's beefed up attacks. And then you get a pretty uplifting ending, and hold on, I think I'm forgetting something. That's right, there's still the best part of this fight, the boss theme. It's easily my favorite track in the game. A lot of the boss themes in this game change with each phase, but it's most noticeable here. It starts off catchy and energetic, then gets a whole new layer with some beautiful singing from Sayu, and eventually the song completely freaks out in the final phase once her creators are put in a corner. All I could say is, if this is only number 4, that's a good sign for what's to come. DJ DJ Subatomic Supernova is legit one of the best first bosses I've ever faced. His fight is a grand spectacle and shows you exactly what you can expect from this game. He works especially well as a first boss because he kind of embodies everything you'd expect from this game's premise and makes it work great. Think about it. When you think EDM, what's the first kind of music you imagine? Probably some funky, slightly otherworldly club beat, right? Well, that's what you get here. The beat sounds great, and the decision to combine a dance club with an outer space motif is brilliant and leads to some really cool scenery. How about personality, though? Given what we know about the NSR artists at the beginning, what you would expect them to be like? Well, probably really full of themselves, maybe thinking they're so much deeper than everyone else. Well, that isn't true with most of the NSR artists, but it definitely is here. I mean, for God's sake, his name is DJ Subatomic Supernova. That's a name that only comes from trying so hard to sound deep, you miss the obvious contradiction. His massive ego is reflected in the fight as well. He's constantly in the middle of the stage, acting as the center of attention, and he only gets bigger with each phase. He starts off at a DJ booth, which is pretty normal, but then he grows to the point of being at the center of an asteroid field with literal planets revolving around him. The battlefield is essentially saying he's the center of the universe. The world revolves around him. It all looks really cool. Even his form with the big squiggly arms looks more cool and otherworldly than awkward and goofy. But how does the fight itself play? It's a lot of fun. It's simple enough for a first boss, but complex enough to still be interesting. The first phase is pretty easy to understand. You break the asteroids to get notes to shoot at DJ Sub-Sub. The only attack you really have to worry about is him spinning them around on the stage like a record on a turntable. The other two phases have the same idea, but pile on more attacks like a rotating laser, shockwave, and a 2D section where he hurls planets at you. Then the final phase is pretty simple, but gets you some good practice with parrying. It's all a lot of fun and looks really cool. Typically, first bosses tend to be pretty simple to ease players into things, but DJ Subatomic Supernova proves you can still do something spectacular with them. While the bosses in this game have a lot of personality, and their fights do a great job of telling their stories, none of these stories have much of a connection to Mayday and Zook's journey, other than being obstacles between them and Tatiana. Now, that's fine and all, but there is one boss who breaks this trend. Eve. Eve might just be my favorite character in the game. Her status as Zook's former bandmate adds an interesting emotional dynamic to the fight, and despite the fact that she's essentially a bitter ex-girlfriend, she somehow manages to come across as more dignified than clingy. Her artwork is so strange, yet she's so confident in it, and somehow doesn't come across as pretentious, just really in her own world. And all of this carries into the fight. For starters, there's the setting. This is probably my favorite battlefield in the game. Eve's sense of style is so out there that even the approach segment was interesting. As for the fight itself, it starts off pretty standard. Eve will warp around the room, but not in this same manic way that Tatiana did, and use various elements of the room to attack you, such as arms coming out of the floor to shoot eyes at you, and hands that act like enemies. I know that sounds crazy, but just remember, this is the simple part of the fight. Things really go nuts in the second phase, where she separates Mayday and Zook into separate halls, which both make sense for her strategically and emotionally given everything we know about her. What's really interesting about this part of the fight is that the music is different depending on which character you're playing as. While it sounds otherworldly regardless, it's much more dark and intense in Mayday's hall and more calm and soothing in Zook's. The same can be said about her attacks. She's constantly moving between the two halls and mostly lets the environment do the attacking. And the attacks in Mayday's hall are much more aggressive, which again fits with her character. Eve is genuinely angry with Mayday because in her mind, she's the one standing between her and Zook. Meanwhile, with Zook, her attacks are less aggressive as she misses him and can't bring herself to genuinely be mad at him. You'd think that this would throw off the balance of the fight, making it so you'd only want to play as Zook, but not really. Since she moves between the halls, you'll probably want to be switching, and Mayday has more options for hurting her thanks to the transformations. So it's really a question of offense versus defense. Also, the attacks in this phase get wild, both from the challenge of avoiding fighting them, and for just what they are. I mean, you've got tons of hands attacking you, feet stomping you, and eyes shooting lasers through Illuminati windows. It's so intense and surreal and weird, and I love it. The third phase is more of the same, which is more than welcome. And the fourth phase has you reuniting Mayday and Zook by having you control them simultaneously while running through the halls and still avoiding Eve's attacks. And after they finish off Eve, Zook decides to go back and talk with her, and it's easily my favorite cutscene in the game. Eve's not just some jealous ex-girlfriend. She's a mad genius of a musician who's confident in her craft, but just wants someone who can work on the same level as her. And Zook tried to be that person, but couldn't. It really is an emotional story, but there's still one fight I like better. Well, there's no use hiding it. If you've played this game, you've already figured out who number 1 is. So, what puts Yinu above all the other bosses? Well, in addition to doing everything I would want from a boss in this game, and doing it well, this fight feels like more of a grand spectacle than any of the others. Let's start with the music. It's fantastic. I still like Sayu's theme more, but this is a close second. You see, Yinu is a child prodigy piano player, so her theme is a piano symphony along with some other classical instruments thrown in, and my god is it epic. Not only is the song intense, but this fight is also the most consistent and noticeable when it comes to the boss attacking to the beat of the music, so you've really got to listen to the song. The fight is made up of 4 phases, each getting harder as they go, and changing the fight dramatically with each one. You don't even start at the boss. You have to make your way toward the stage while dodging her sliding notes and then smash the lock on the gate while avoiding her explosions. Then, once you're on the stage, Yinu's held out of reach by a mysterious red hand. So you have to dodge and parry her notes some more and shoot her out of the sky. Once all the strings have broken, the red creature reveals itself as Yinu's mother. Yinu has the same attacks as before, except now the stage will sometimes go dark and Yinu will shoot rapid fire notes at you while her mom sends shockwaves across the battlefield. It's a nice, intense way to mix things up. Also, now the way to damage Yinu has changed. You still have to fire notes at her to knock her out of the air, but now whenever she falls down, her mom will make herself vulnerable to protect Yinu. So now you're attacking the mom. Once this is finished, the stage crumbles away and you find yourself on this desolate, vine-covered platform. This phase plays similarly to the last one, only now the attacks are more frequent and Yinu's mother has some new moves. Then with the next phase, the fight changes completely. Yinu is out of the picture entirely and her mother has you trapped in a cage. The music shifts from a classical opera to an EDM remix and the attacks become more frantic. Yinu's mom places landmines, has a bunch of piano pins slam the ground, which is really hard to dodge if you miss the tell, and she even smashes her face into the ground just to create shockwaves to hurt you. Anyway, you beat her, and Mayday and Zook rev up their instruments to deal the finishing blow, but the fight isn't actually over yet. Instead, Yinu is pissed that her concert was crashed by Bunk Bed Junction, and that her mom upstaged her in her own fight. So, she unleashes one last piano solo of blind fury, and you have to climb up to get her while dodging her notes, which is fairly easy, but still intense given how much you've likely been weakened from the fight. And once you get to her, there's no epic finishing blow. The fight is just over. She essentially stole your finishing move like you stole her concert. Now, if you've been paying attention, you may have noticed the clever visual storytelling surrounding Yinu's mother. She starts off completely hidden. You have no way of knowing she's there. Then you just see her hand. Then she fully reveals herself, but still mostly stays in the shadows. Then when she gets really angry, she becomes the center of attention, and after that, the fight drops any pretense of being about Yinu. Also, her appearance gets more and more monstrous as the fight goes on. Everything about the fight, from the brief cutscenes to the phase changes, and even the movements of the characters, tells you everything you need to know about the relationship between these two. Yinu's mother loves her and genuinely wants to see her succeed, but she can be overbearing and overprotective to the point where she completely upstages her daughter. However, after the fight is over and Yinu's piano gets tragically smashed, they reunite, simply playing what's left of the broken instrument. No words are exchanged because they don't need to be. And really, all of this is an example of why the bosses in No Straight Roads are so great. The music is great, the fights play really well, for the most part, the setups are really creative and intense, and the attention to detail is stellar, telling the boss's story in really clever ways through the gameplay. I am Defophilizer, and while No Straight Roads may have a lot of problems, I will never say it's not worth your time.